As the warm yet derivative embrace of the mid-70s looses its grip on you, you delve further and further into time, finding yourself in 1979. Strange things happen. Fred, Daphne, and Velma are nowhere to be seen. A new figure approaches in the mist. You know him for his small stature and grating catchphrase. You now enter the Scrappy Doo era. Love him or hate him, Scrappy Doo was integral to the 80s version of Scooby Doo. When he was introduced in '79, he revitalized the stagnant ratings, and the message was pretty clear to executives. Give people more of the little talking dog. The early 80s saw a slew of Scrappy-related shorts and shows. They had occasional appearances of other human members of the gang, but Shaggy was the only one to appear in every episode. By 1983, Daphne permanently rejoined the gang, but she was the only one. The 1988 animated TV movie Scooby Doo and the Reluctant Werewolf was Scrappy's last appearance until 2002. Okay, unrelated, but very important. In this one, A, Shaggy's a werewolf, B, he has a girlfriend named Googie, and it's the only time she's ever appeared in any movies, shows, shorts, you name it. This is the only appearance of Googie. I have so many questions. The series I want to focus on for Daphne is the 1985 The 13 Ghosts of Scooby Doo. This was an interesting one. It was a flop initially. In this, ghosts were both real and terrorizing the world. They had another pint-sized sidekick named Flim Flam, and Vincent Price was a character. Most importantly, Daphne's outfits changed episode to episode, which is especially surprising considering how cheap and wooden the rest of the animation is. For the first time, we see Daphne in pants options. What strikes me about this series is, despite the fact her outfits are generally things that were worn in the 80s, they're not super trendy, and they lack a certain loudness. If we take a look at 80s fashion, things got progressively exaggerated as the decade went on. More patterns, more textures, brighter, cooler colors, bigger hair, more accessories, more, all of it, add more. My mom always describes the fashion of the 80s as your closet threw up on you, not because it was necessarily bad, but because it looked like you were wearing everything in your closet all at once. These looks were definitely on the right track, but they feel a bit older, like they were designed during the transition from 70s fashion to 80s fashion. Especially her hair, which appears to be a page boy bob, which is like a staple of the 70s. I researched hard, but I couldn't find an 80s equivalent closer than this. So this time, I'm going to crank things in the other direction and use this pattern from McCall's in 1989 to boost the 80s-osity of it all. By this point, thanks to power dressing and Pretty in Pink, the ideal feminine shape was a triangle. And now, a word on belts. So I went to the thrift store. I found this. I bought it solely for the belt buckle because, as you can see on the pattern, this requires a dope and funky belt. However, thrift stores really, they either need to stick to the name thrift or start rebranding, because this was the only $2 belt in the store that I could find that was like the right size. Most of them were over $5, and I'm sorry, but like, I'm of an age. You could go to the thrift store and get any belt you wanted for $2. When I was there the other day, I saw one for $17 for a belt. I don't even think it was real leather. Anyway, so what we're gonna do is snippy snap this off and then make, a sort of basic pattern out of what we got here. And then I think we'll have a belt. And a decent one at that. I actually kind of need to use these scissors. They're blunt and I don't want to use my good scissors on this, 'cause it's plastic. This belt was so gross. It seemed to be made of like a grocery bag plastic. 0 out of 10. Would never do again. supervisor was deeply involved in this project. It was her personal mission to oversee everything and make sure that there were no mice hiding in any of the fabric. At first, I tried marking the metal buckle and pressing it into the fabric, but well, sometimes I guess it's just easier to trace. I added a ribbon to the end of the belt for ease of turning it outside right. This is a pretty common technique, but I've yet to actually pull it off. When I was sewing the tube, I guess I caught some of it in the stitching.
About that window dressing, when it's what's inside the store that counts.
At this point, the seam ripper and I are just besties.
This clarity I now renounce.
Once I re-sewed and turned the belt tube, I ironed it, folding it in a little to make sure that it had actually fit the buckle. I stitched it to the buckle, and it was time to move on to the main event. For once, I tried laying out the pattern pieces the way the pattern suggests, but I find it's almost always easier to do it your own way. See, even the supervisor was having none of it, so I did it my way instead. I was cutting it close with this one, but we made it work. I ironed all the interfacing to the facing pieces, then folded the shoulder pleats. I basted them down and then sewed the shoulder seams. They get a cute little top stitch because they deserve it. I stay stitched the neckline, and then it was time for the collar. As I pinned the collar to the neckline, I really started to get into the weeds. Not even my supervisor could help me, and usually she does.
Okay, that's deeply confusing, but I get it now. Sometimes it just helps to read thoroughly and actually use your elementary school education.
So, I followed the instructions to the best of my ability. Taken somewhat of a turn. I just spent the last half hour desperately attempting to sew the interfacing and the collar together to the bodice, and there's just going to be a tuck, and that's just going to be how it has to be, because this is the most confusing, backwards, ununderstandable way I have ever seen a collar asked to be constructed before. What they want me to do is attach the collar and the front facing to the bodice at the same time as attaching the two pieces together. And to that I ask, why? Whomst? How? Like, in theory it works, but the problem is that you're trying to keep too many things out of the way of each other at the same time, and you could just sew the facing to the collar and the facing together to the bodice. This is how most of them do it. Or they have the good sense to have a neckband, because it's not that hard to get a neckband. So, you know, we're struggling. I think I'm just gonna finish up these steps off camera, partially because I thought I was filming for like 10 minutes, and I wasn't. And in that time, I sewed and resewed the collar like in 3 different places, because things that weren't supposed to get caught were getting caught, or notched, or whatever. Spirits are low, but hopes are high. High hopes. Wow. It is like stormy out. Like, it is like, hold on, I'll show you. I love pinning sleeves flat. Usually they get the best results, and you don't have to worry about tucks as much.
Since the mind set sail, I've been swimming. Tongue-tied, it's a weird way of living. Clocks are running fast, or maybe they've stopped. Time feels fake, and my focus is shot. Set sail for the high seas of thinking. Capsize on the jagged rocks I'm sinking. What's real, what's fake, what's
Do you ever just choose the more difficult path by accident because you think it's the easier path? That's been this whole project. So far. Yesterday afternoon, I was gonna French seam all of the side, sleeve, and arm seams, fully forgetting that if you're gonna do that, you have to sew half the seam allowance and then another half the seam allowance. Instead, what I did was just sew the full seam allowance. And then because it was getting late, I was like, it's okay, I can fix it. I'll just flat fell those seams. And then I remembered that arms are tubes, and I have to get this vertically all through the sewing machine. That isn't necessarily compatible. I've made it work before. I'm gonna give it a go. If it doesn't work, I'll just spend the time to unpick the seams and properly sew it. But, you know, fingers crossed. Let's try it the hard way and see if it works, because sometimes the hard way is faster. The 80s have not been kind to me. I blame Ronald Reagan, as many should for many things. Victory! That sounded like one of those 90s witches you get for Halloween. Ooh! I can't believe that worked. Sometimes you just gotta shove something through the machine and really massage the fabric like a tax evader massaging their numbers. I did lose the plot exactly once, but that was nothing compared to the collar. Let this be a testament to the power of fixing your own mistakes. You can make mistakes, and then you can try and fix them the wrong way, and sometimes it's gonna work anyway. And sometimes it will also fail, but like, mess around and see what happens, baby. Let's keep moving, shall we? At this point, all that was left was to sew the cuffs. I turned them up a 1/4 inch, then a full inch, pressed it in place, and let her rip. Honestly, the bodice on its own is a pretty dope crop jacket. I was vibing hard. I wonder about the 80s as a decade in Scooby-Doo history, because while there were some pretty crass, commercially driven choices, like dumping the classic gang for Scrappy Doo, they also took some risks and really tried to update Scooby in a way that was relatable to modern audiences of the time. There are still some choices that make no sense to me, like changing Shaggy's shirt to red just to match the new design of the Mystery Machine. They didn't even update his line art, they just made it red. But doing things like playing with whether or not monsters were real, getting legitimate horror greats like Vincent Price, and giving the Mystery Machine a more 80s look were steps in the right direction, I think. By the 80s, Scooby-Doo could have faded into the background with the majority of the short-lived Hanna-Barbera shows as nostalgic relics. It may have been an ugly growing period, but it was necessary for Scooby-Doo to continue on. Honestly, I feel the same way about 80s fashion. It's not really my favorite, style-wise, shape-wise, or color-wise, but I love that it was a decade that grew in a new direction and took big swings. And honestly, wearing shoulder pads does make you feel powerful. In the evening, I used some handy stash fabric to cover my shoulder pads. I tried my best to pin the pads without any wrinkles or tucks and zigzag stitched them over. I trimmed off all the excess when I was done. I have no idea if I was correct in this, but it seems to have worked. Hello, and welcome to the beach house. As you can see, I'm in full vacation uncle attire, and that's because it's Saturday. Sometimes you intend to finish a product on Friday, but sometimes the material does not get in until Tuesday in the evening, and there's nothing you can do about it. So sometimes you do the project on Saturday anyway. We're actually making good progress. I got almost everything done last night. As you can see from the inside, I still need to make the elastic casing, put the elastic in, figure out how much I actually need to use because I don't have the elastic guide. Sometimes that happens with vintage patterns, and if it's the one to lose, it's kind of the one that's okay because you're gonna play it by ear anyway. If something doesn't fit, you just lengthen or shorten it. It's not the end of the world. Gotta edge stitch the facings and get that like sort of top stitched look all over. And hot dang, if I didn't just already have pretty great buttons. This is the beauty of having a vintage button collection. You kind of never know what you're gonna get when you buy big bags from the thrift store or yard sales full of carded buttons, because it is up to the whim of whatever person who didn't want those buttons anymore. I think these will be perfect. Very Daphne and also very 80s. It's that they're not, in perfect brand new condition, but it's got that very powdery pink, but also bright pink that kind of splits the Daphne uprights. It's not my favorite pink, I'll be honest, but here's the thing. The 80s, despite everybody's revisionist history that the 80s was all about neons, the 80s had accent colors of neons sometimes. You know what the 80s was about? Cool jewel tones and powdery colors. For reasons I can't comprehend, the pendulum of culture and design shifts back and forth decade to decade, and the 70s was so warm and delicious and tasty, and I love an earth tone, I love a warm color, I love the richness of it, and the 80s was just, they'd had enough. And I mean, if the 70s was anything like the 2010s, where if I ever have to look at a grade object ever again, or a minimalist interior where zero personality exists because it's all about having a perfect clean space, I'm gonna do a murder. So that's the structural stuff left, and then, we just gotta hem this bad boy up. I also have a few accessories I made off camera. I had a little bit of like lavender knit, so I made a scrunchie, as one does, because it's the 80s. I couldn't find chunky socks, so I kind of just made some like faux cuffs that I could scrunch up like big thick socks that I could roll down, simply because I don't think they make those A, in this color, or B, at all anymore. I have not seen thick socks like that ever. This gives the illusion just fine, so I'm happy with these. It'll do the job just dandy. It's already like 3 p.m. I want to get this finished today, so we're just gonna do it. We're just gonna go like gangbusters. This will be done by dinner time. It has to be. I'm shooting this tomorrow. Come on now. Come on. I had to guess a little at sewing down the elastic casing because there wasn't a market in the pocket for sewing the line, and it wasn't just a regular 5/8 inch. It was a bit touch and go there, but the elastic fit okay, and hey, no one died. With some hemming, top stitching, and buttons, I was good to go. So, how did I do? So far, this definitely felt the most costumey of my Daphne looks, but I do love a good jumpsuit. I do think I could have worked to achieve peak 80s poofage a little bit more, but I really enjoyed crimping my hair. It's very fun to feel like you're... Is that so? It's very fun to feel like your hair is a poodle. I want to give a very big shout out to my friend Duarte for helping me film the reveal. It was really fun and I was very excited to do it. If you liked this video, don't forget to like it, and if you don't want the party to stop, go ahead and subscribe. If this is your first foray into the Daphne journey, I highly recommend you check out the rest of the playlist. We're like 3 decades deep. You can check that out here. And if you want to check out what else I'm up to, YouTube thinks you'll like this. I was gonna make a joke about getting a call on my Nextel, but clearly my cat needs desperate lovings and attention, so I guess I gotta pet her now. I'll see you on the flip-flop.